My name is Demetrius Harlow, a blacksmith who survived the first week of the zombie apocalypse when Pittsburgh became ground zero. The infection swept through our city in just days. I watched my students die. I killed my infected friend. I forged weapons from scrap metal to defend what remained of our humanity. This is how a teacher became a survivor. Before we start the video, let us know what country you are tuning in from in the comment section below. Perhaps we will make a story there. Let's begin. I woke up that morning thinking it would be just another Tuesday. That's the thing about the end of the world. It never announces itself. It just shows up unannounced on an otherwise ordinary day. My name is Demetrius Harlow. Before everything went to hell, I was an industrial arts teacher at McKinley Technical High School in Pittsburgh. My students called me Mr. H, though a few of the seniors had taken to calling me Forge after they found out about my weekend hobby of traditional blacksmithing. I remember that last normal day so clearly now. The morning news was reporting an increase in hospital admissions for what they were calling an aggressive flu. The anchor mentioned something about the CDC monitoring the situation, but nothing to be concerned about yet. I remember thinking, great, half my class will be out sick by next week. If only that had been the worst of it. I arrived at school around 7:30 like I did every morning. The security guard, Mr. Reynolds, nodded at me as I badged in. "Morning, Mr. Harlow. Heard about this flu thing? My wife's hospital is apparently packed." I told him my mother always said to take extra vitamin C and keep washing your hands. We both laughed. Mr. Reynolds didn't make it through the week. I hope it was quick for him. My first class that day was Intro to Metalworking with the sophomores. Good kids mostly, still finding their way. Not many students choose industrial arts these days. Most are pushed toward computer science or business. But my kids, they were different. They wanted to make things with their hands, to understand how the physical world works. I respected that. Carlos Mendez was first to class that day, which was unusual. He was a bright kid, but perpetually late. "Mr. H, I finished that bracket project early," he said, pulling a neatly finished piece from his backpack. It was good work, clean welds, properly deburred edges. "My dad says this is all useless, though," he added with a frown. "Says everything's made in factories now and I should learn coding instead." I remember exactly what I told him because of how cruelly prophetic it became. "Carlos, when civilization falls apart, the coders won't save us. It'll be people who know how to make and fix things with their hands." We both laughed. By Friday, Carlos would be dead, and my words would haunt me. The rest of that class, I taught them how to forge a simple knife from scrap steel. Basic, practical knowledge. "This isn't just about making a blade," I told them. "It's about understanding transformation. How materials can change form but retain their essence. Steel remembers every hammer blow. It carries the history of its making in its very structure." Some of them rolled their eyes. Some of them wouldn't live long enough to understand what I meant. Jamal Williams stayed after class like he often did. 17, senior, with hands that seemed born to metalwork. The kind of natural talent that comes along maybe once in a teaching career. "Mr. H, I was thinking about that scholarship to the technical college. My mom says we can't afford the housing even with the tuition covered." "We'll figure something out," I promised him. "Talent like yours shouldn't go to waste." I meant it too. I'd already spoken to some contacts about additional funding. We never got to finish that conversation properly. The world had other plans. By lunch, there were whispers among the staff. More students absent than usual. The school nurse, Miss Patel, mentioned she'd sent 3 kids home already with high fevers. The administration was fielding calls from worried parents, but the official line was business as usual. Principal Davidson kept saying it was just seasonal flu, nothing to worry about. My afternoon advanced class was smaller than usual. We were working on a collaborative public art piece, a metal sculpture for the city park. Art is how civilization marks its existence, I told them. Long after we're gone, the things we create will tell our story. I didn't realize how soon that philosophy would be tested. During sixth period, there was a commotion in the hallway. Carlos had returned to school, but something was wrong. Ms. Patel was trying to help him to the nurse's office, but he was disoriented, aggressive even. His skin had a gray pallor to it that I'd never seen before. I stepped into the hall to assist, but the vice principal waved me back into my classroom. Just a reaction to medication, he said, but his face told a different story. By final bell, nearly a third of the students had been picked up early. The parking lot was chaotic, with parents arriving all at once. I overheard fragments of conversation. They've closed the hospital emergency room. My cousin said patients are attacking staff. The National Guard is setting up at the bridges. I was cleaning up the shop when Principal Davidson made an announcement over the intercom. His voice was strained, lacking its usual confidence. Due to the developing health situation, school will be closed tomorrow. Students who haven't been picked up should report to the gymnasium. Staff are asked to assist until all students have been collected. I locked up the shop and headed to the gym. There were maybe 60 kids left, mostly from working-class families who couldn't leave jobs to pick up their children at a moment's notice. The athletic director was trying to organize a basketball game to keep them occupied, but there was a tension in the air. Cell phone reception was spotty, and the kids who could get through to parents were hearing disturbing news. By 6 o'clock, the number had dwindled to 14 students. The principal had left, claiming he needed to coordinate with district officials. Most other teachers had gone too. Only myself, the gym teacher, Coach Alvarez, and the English teacher, Ms. Thompson, remained. They're saying it's not really a flu, Ms. Thompson whispered to me. My brother works at UPMC, says people are coming in with bites, then turning violent. I didn't want to believe it, but by 7, the evidence was hard to ignore. The streets outside were increasingly chaotic. Sirens wailed constantly. A military helicopter flew low over the school. Cell service failed completely. The few local channels we could get on the gymnasium TV were broadcasting emergency alerts, advising people to stay indoors and avoid contact with agitated individuals. Jamal approached me, his usual confidence replaced with barely controlled fear. Mr. H., my mom's not answering. Our apartment's on the north side. I need to get home. I put my hand on his shoulder. It's not safe out there right now. We need to stay put until morning at least. I didn't tell him what I'd glimpsed through the windows, figures moving with unnatural, jerky motions, or the person I'd seen fall under an attack by what looked like several others on the street corner. By 9 o'clock, we'd moved everyone to the cafeteria. It had fewer windows and multiple refrigerators full of food. Coach Alvarez had found emergency flashlights and a battery-powered radio. The news was fragmented but increasingly alarming. Reports of mass casualties, hospital failures, violent attacks. The term infected was being used. No one said zombie yet, but the descriptions left little doubt. Ms. Thompson broke down around 10, saying she needed to find her daughter who was with a babysitter. We couldn't convince her to stay. Coach Alvarez walked her to her car. He came back alone, looking shaken. "There's something very wrong out there," was all he said. I couldn't sleep that night. I sat with the radio, listening as reports became more desperate, then gradually fewer and farther between. The 14 students slept fitfully on cafeteria tables pushed together. I made mental inventory of what we had. Food for maybe 3 days if we rationed. Water from the taps still worked. The metal shop had tools that could be weapons if needed. My phone battery died around midnight, the last message from my grandmother unanswered. I remember looking out the small cafeteria window at the city I'd lived in my entire life. Fires had broken out in several locations. The power was still on in some neighborhoods, off in others, creating a patchwork of light and darkness. I thought about Carlos, about what was happening to him, about how quickly normalcy had evaporated. I made a decision then, watching Pittsburgh begin to burn. If we were going to survive, we needed more than just a temporary shelter. We needed a defensible position, supplies, and most importantly, a way to create what we couldn't scavenge. We needed my friend Tony Russo's auto shop, with its fully equipped garage and the small forge he'd installed for custom work. What I didn't know then was how much blood would be spilled before we reached it, or how that simple blacksmithing equipment would become the heart of a community of survivors. I didn't know how many of those 14 students would die in the coming days, or how the skills I'd taught as cultural heritage would become the difference between life and death. As dawn broke on Wednesday, I woke the students. Things have changed, I told them simply, and we need to adapt to survive. I didn't know then that I was looking at the first citizens of what would later be called the Forge, the community that would become a beacon in the dead city of Pittsburgh. The students took the news better than I expected. Maybe they'd seen too many movies about this exact scenario, or maybe the reality hadn't fully sunk in yet. Either way, we needed to make the school more secure while we figured out our next move. I sent Jamal and 2 other seniors, Marcus and Deshaun, to check the exterior doors. Coach Alvarez went to raid the athletic department for anything useful. I took the rest of the students to the cafeteria kitchen to sort through food supplies. Take anything that doesn't need cooking or refrigeration, I instructed. Protein bars, canned goods, bottled water. I noticed Tanya, a quiet sophomore, trembling as she worked. "Hey, you doing okay?" She shook her head. "My little brother has asthma. My mom went to get his medication yesterday morning. She never came back." The girl's voice cracked, but she didn't cry. I put my hand on her shoulder, not knowing what to say. False hope seemed cruel, but so did harsh reality. "We'll figure it out together," I finally said. It became my mantra over the coming days, a promise I couldn't always keep. Jamal's group returned with troubling news. "East entrance has been forced open, Mr. H. Blood on the floor, but no one around." His eyes were hard, focused. Fear had transformed into something else. Determination, maybe. "We closed it with a chain from the janitor's closet, but it won't hold if something really wants in." Coach Alvarez returned with a duffel bag. Baseball bats, track hurdles we can use as barriers, first aid kits from the training room. He pulled out a handheld emergency radio. "Got this from the security office. Channels are mostly static, but there's military communication on frequency 7. We gathered in the cafeteria as morning light strengthened. Through windows, we could see occasional movement on the streets, some people running with purpose, others moving with that strange, lurching gait that had already become recognizable as infected. Smoke rose from multiple locations downtown. "We need to get to the metal shop," I said. "It's the most secure room in the building, and we have tools there that could be useful." I didn't explicitly say weapons, but everyone understood. Moving through the school corridors felt surreal. Abandoned backpacks, a dropped cell phone still displaying a text message cut mid-sentence, a single shoe in the hallway. The everyday detritus of student life transformed into artifacts of a vanished civilization. We reached the metal shop without incident. The heavy fire doors and limited windows made it naturally defensible. I unlocked the supply cage and began distributing safety equipment. Thick gloves, face shields, heavy aprons. "Put these on," I told them. If we have to go outside, they might prevent bites. Marcus, a football player with an artist's temperament, looked at me with dawning comprehension. You're thinking like it's those zombie movies, aren't you? That's what this is? I hesitated. I don't know what to call it. But from what we've seen, it spreads through contact. Probably bites. And it changes people. I gestured to the tools around us. What I do know is that we have resources here. Knowledge. Skills. We can use those to survive. We spent the morning reinforcing doors, taking inventory, and monitoring the radio. The broadcasts grew increasingly grim. Martial law declarations, evacuation orders for certain neighborhoods, warnings to avoid the infected at all costs. The term contamination event was used repeatedly, but details were sparse. Around noon, we heard screaming from the main hallway. Coach Alvarez and I went to investigate, armed with a baseball bat and a metal rod from the shop. The sight that greeted us still haunts me. Miss Patel, the school nurse, was in the corridor. But she wasn't the calm, efficient woman I'd known for years. Her scrubs were soaked with blood, her movements jerky and wrong. When she saw us, she made a guttural sound and charged. Coach reacted first, swinging the bat. He connected with her shoulder, which would have dropped a normal person. Miss Patel didn't even slow down. She lunged at him, teeth bared. I shoved the metal rod against her chest, keeping her at bay. Her eyes held no recognition, no humanity. "The head," Coach shouted. "In the movies, it's always the head." I didn't want to. This was a colleague, someone I'd shared lunches with, someone who had tended to my students when they were hurt. But the thing before me wasn't Miss Patel anymore. When she lunged again, I swung the rod like a baseball bat, connecting with her temple. She dropped immediately. We stood there, breathing hard, staring at what we'd done. "We need to tell the kids," Coach finally said. I nodded, unable to speak. Back in the metal shop, we broke the news. "The infection is in the building," I said simply. "We've contained it for now, but we need to be prepared." I didn't mention that the infected had been Ms. Patel. Some of them might have figured it out, but I couldn't bring myself to say it. That afternoon, I began teaching them how to make weapons. We had plenty of material, steel stock of various thicknesses, tools for cutting and shaping. "A good weapon extends your reach," I explained, demonstrating how to attach a sharpened metal piece to a pole. "Keep them at a distance. Don't let them close enough to bite." Jamal caught on quickly, improving my design. "If we add a crossbar here," he suggested, "it can also push them back without penetrating." The student had become the innovator. I felt a momentary surge of pride amid the horror. By evening, everyone had some form of protection. We established a watch rotation and tried to get some sleep. I found myself unable to close my eyes for long, listening to every creak and groan of the old school building. Dawn brought new problems. The power began fluctuating and the water pressure weakened. "They're losing control of the infrastructure," I realized aloud. On the emergency radio, military chatter suggested they were falling back from certain areas of the city to establish containment zones. Our neighborhood wasn't inside those zones. Around 10 in the morning, we heard glass breaking somewhere in the building. Coach Alvarez and I, along with Jamal and Marcus, went to investigate. 4 infected had broken through a classroom window. One of them was a student I recognized from junior year chemistry. We managed to eliminate the threat, but Marcus was scratched during the encounter. "It's nothing," he insisted, covering the wound with his hand. "Just caught myself on broken glass." I wasn't sure if scratches transmitted the infection, but I cleaned and bandaged it anyway, watching him carefully throughout the day. He seemed fine. No fever, no disorientation. Maybe we'd gotten lucky. As afternoon faded into evening, we gathered to discuss our situation. "The school isn't secure enough," I said. Too many entrances, too many windows, and our supplies won't last. Where would we go? Asked Tanya, who had become something of a quartermaster, organizing our food and water. I have a friend who owns an auto shop about 6 blocks from here, Tony Russo. It has an apartment above it, metal security gates, and most importantly, a forge. I saw confusion on some faces. A blacksmithing forge. With it we can make tools, weapons, repair things. Whatever we need. 6 blocks through that? Deshawn pointed toward the window, where an infected wandered aimlessly on the street below. It won't be easy, I admitted, but staying here isn't an option long term. That night, as others slept, Marcus's condition deteriorated rapidly. Fever set in, followed by delirium. By midnight, he couldn't recognize us. Coach Alvarez and I moved him to a separate classroom, one we could secure. We took turns watching him through the small door window. Around 3 a.m, Marcus stopped moving. I thought he'd died. Then, 20 minutes later, he sat up with unnatural stiffness. His eyes, when they opened, were vacant. The pupils dilated despite the light we shone in. He began throwing himself against the door. Coach and I looked at each other, the same terrible knowledge in our eyes. "I'll do it," Coach said quietly. He was my linebacker, my responsibility. I handed him a sharpened pipe we'd fashioned. "I'll come with you." What happened in that classroom is something I've tried to forget. The boy who emerged wasn't Marcus anymore, just a shell driven by the infection. But knowing that didn't make it any easier to end him. We wrapped his body in a tarp from the art room and placed him in a maintenance closet. There was no time or safety for proper burial. By morning, our resolve to leave had hardened. The school that had been our sanctuary was becoming a trap. I gathered everyone in the metal shop and laid out my plan. "We'll go at dawn tomorrow," I explained. "Light enough to see, but early enough that there should be fewer infected active." I didn't actually know if they were less active at certain times, but it seemed a reasonable assumption. "We'll move in a tight formation. Coach at the rear, me at the front, everyone armed, everyone watching all directions." That day was devoted to preparation. We modified our makeshift weapons based on what we'd learned fighting the infected. I taught them how to wrap metal around their forearms and shins as improvised armor. We packed essential supplies into backpacks, focusing on portable food, water, and medical equipment. Jamal worked quietly beside me, fashioning a particularly effective spear. "Marcus was my friend since 3rd grade, he said suddenly. "If we make it to this forge place, I want to make something for him. Something that lasts." I nodded. "Steel remembers," I said, echoing my classroom lesson that now seemed from another lifetime. "When this is all over, we'll make memorials for everyone we've lost." Oh. That night, I found it impossible to sleep. Tomorrow we would venture into the infected city, 14 of us against unknown numbers of the turned. I went over the route in my mind, trying to anticipate every potential danger, every needed contingency. But the truth was, we were stepping into chaos with nothing but improvised weapons and desperate hope. I watched the sky gradually lighten from black to deep blue. Dawn was approaching. It was time to wake the others and begin our journey through the fallen city. A journey that would cost us dearly before it was done. I woke everyone before the sun fully rose. There was no ceremony to our departure, just quiet determination and fear barely kept in check. 13 of us remained. Myself, Coach Alvarez, and 11 students ranging from 14 to 18 years old. Each carried a backpack with supplies and wielded some form of weapon we'd created in the metal shop. "Remember the formation," I instructed as we gathered at the east exit, the one furthest from the main road. "Coach takes the rear. I lead. Jamal and Deshaun on the flanks. Everyone else stays tight in the middle. We move quickly but quietly. If someone falls behind, we all stop. No one gets left alone. The weight of responsibility pressed down on me. These were children I was leading into danger, my students, entrusted to my care. But staying meant certain death as supplies dwindled and more infected found their way in. We had to move. I pushed open the door, the morning air cool against my face. The street before us was littered with abandoned cars, scattered possessions, occasional dark stains I tried not to look at too closely. In the distance, smoke still rose from parts of downtown. The world had transformed in just 2 days. 6 blocks, I reminded them. Stay focused. I pointed east, where Russo's auto shop waited, hopefully intact. We follow Liberty Avenue, then cut through the alley behind the old theater. We moved cautiously at first, all of us startling at every sound. 3 houses down, we encountered our first infected, an elderly man in blood-soaked pajamas. His movements were slow, uncoordinated. I gestured for the group to stop while Jamal and I approached from different angles. "Remember what I taught you," I said quietly. "Aim for the head. Keep your distance." The confrontation was brief and brutal. The man who had once been someone's grandfather, someone's husband, was now just a threat to be eliminated. I felt nothing as he fell, not satisfaction, not remorse, just grim necessity. This emotional detachment would become familiar in the days ahead, a protective numbness that allowed us to do what needed doing. We continued down the block without further incident. At the corner of Liberty Avenue, we paused to assess. The main road was more exposed but offered a straight shot toward our destination. The side streets meant more turns, more blind corners, more chances for ambush. Main road, I decided. We can see farther ahead. That decision nearly cost us everything. 2 blocks down Liberty, we encountered a group of infected clustered around what had once been a bus stop. At least 8 of them, more than we'd faced at once. They noticed us immediately, their vacant eyes fixing on our movement, their bodies turning with singular purpose. "Defensive formation," Coach called from the rear. The students moved with surprising coordination, forming a circle with weapons pointed outward. We'd practiced this in the gym, but practice hadn't included the moans of the infected or the smell of decay already setting in. The first wave came at us from the front. I took down 2 with my metal staff, aiming for the temples as we'd learned was most effective. Beside me, Jamal handled a third with his spear, keeping it at bay before delivering a final thrust. The other students fought with varying degrees of effectiveness, some landing solid blows, others barely managing to fend off their attackers. When it was over, all 8 infected lay motionless on the cracked asphalt. We'd suffered no casualties, but the confrontation had drawn attention. More infected were emerging from buildings along the avenue, drawn by the commotion. "We need to move," I urged. "Now." We picked up our pace, jogging rather than walking, still maintaining formation. The exertion made conversation impossible, which was probably for the best. None of us needed to voice the growing realization that Pittsburgh had fallen more completely than we'd imagined. In the brief glimpses I caught through cross streets, I saw no signs of organized response, no police or military presence, just occasional survivors hurrying like we were, or the shambling forms of the infected. 4 blocks in, disaster struck. Lisa, a freshman who'd been in my introductory class, tripped on a broken piece of concrete and fell hard. The sound of her cry drew immediate attention from 3 infected emerging from a convenience store to our right. Coach Alvarez reached her first, hauling her to her feet. But she couldn't put weight on her ankle. "It's twisted bad," he called to me. The infected were closing in and more were noticing our presence. "Deshaun, help Coach with Lisa," I ordered. "Everyone else, defensive positions." We formed a protective circle around the injured girl as Coach and Deshawn supported her weight between them. Our progress slowed to a painful crawl. The infected kept coming, never in overwhelming numbers, but a constant pressure. 2 here, 3 there, emerging from storefronts and side streets. We dispatched them as efficiently as possible, but fatigue was setting in. My arms felt leaden, each swing of my weapon requiring more effort than the last. "There," Jamal pointed ahead. "That's the theater. The alley's just beyond it." The sight gave us renewed energy. We pushed forward, fighting our way past a group of infected clustered near the theater entrance. The alley beckoned, narrow but blessedly empty. Once in the confined space between buildings, we paused to catch our breath. Lisa's ankle had swollen badly. "I can't keep going," she said, tears streaming down her face. "I'm slowing everyone down." "We're not leaving you," I said firmly. 2 more blocks. We can make it." That's when we heard the screams. They came from ahead of us, where the alley opened onto Carson Street. Human screams. Not the moans of infected. Someone still alive, still fighting. I hesitated, torn between investigating and protecting my group. Jamal made the decision for me. "We have to help them," he said, already moving forward. I couldn't stop him without raising my voice, which might attract more infected. Cursing under my breath, I followed, gesturing for the others to stay put with Coach. At the mouth of the alley, we found the source of the screams. A young woman, perhaps college-aged, was fending off 2 infected with nothing but a broken broomstick. Behind her, a younger boy cowered against a wall. Jamal didn't hesitate. He charged forward, his spear taking down one infected with a clean thrust through the eye socket. I handled the second, swinging my metal staff in a wide arc that connected solidly with its skull. The woman stared at us, broomstick still raised defensively. "Who are you?" "I'm a teacher," I said, which felt both completely true and utterly inadequate. "We're headed to Russo's auto shop. It's defensible, has supplies." "My brother," she gestured to the boy who couldn't have been more than 12. "He's diabetic. We were trying to reach the pharmacy when those things surrounded us." Another complication. Another responsibility. But I couldn't turn them away. "Come with us," I said. "We'll figure out the insulin situation once we're safe." We returned to the group and made introductions. The woman was Sophia, her brother Miguel. They joined our formation as we continued through the alley, emerging onto Carson Street just a block from Russo's. That final stretch was perhaps the most difficult. Our group had grown to 15, including one with a twisted ankle and another with a medical condition requiring medication we didn't have. The infected seemed to be growing more numerous, as if the city's entire population was succumbing hour by hour. We fought our way forward, each step a victory, each fallen infected a moment's respite. When Russo's finally came into view, its roll-up garage doors and brick facade never looking so beautiful, I felt a surge of hope. We might actually make it. That hope was tested immediately. The front of the shop was surrounded by infected, at least a dozen milling about aimlessly. Breaking through that concentration would be nearly impossible without casualties. "The back," I whispered to Jamal. "Tony has a delivery entrance through the alley." We backtracked slightly, finding the narrow passage that ran behind the commercial buildings. The delivery entrance was secured with a rolling metal gate, but I knew the code, Tony's father's birthday, which he used for everything despite my warnings about security. As I approached the keypad, a figure lurched from the shadows of the back entrance. Tony Russo, my friend for 15 years, stared at me with vacant eyes. Blood matted his beard and stained his mechanic's coveralls. A chunk of flesh was missing from his neck. I froze, my fingers inches from the keypad. Behind me, the group waited, unaware of the personal nightmare unfolding before me. Tony had been my friend since high school. We'd shared beers and stories in the apartment above this very shop. He'd helped me set up my classroom when I first started teaching. And now he was gone, replaced by this thing that wore his face but held none of his humanity. Mr. H? Jamal's voice brought me back to the present. What's wrong? I couldn't speak. Tony was moving toward me now, recognition dawning in his infected brain. Not of me as his friend, but of me as prey. His mouth opened, revealing blood-stained teeth. It's Mr. Russo, someone whispered behind me. I raised my staff, arms leaden with exhaustion and grief. I'm sorry, Tony, I managed, though I knew he couldn't understand me anymore. I swung the metal rod, a practiced arc now after countless similar motions. Tony fell, and with him died another piece of the world I had known. My hand shook as I punched in the code. The gate rolled up, revealing the dark interior of the back room. Get inside, I ordered, my voice rough. Quickly. As the last student entered, I took one final look at my friend's body. There would be no time for burial, no funeral, no proper goodbye. Just one more loss in a world suddenly defined by them. I stepped inside and secured the gate behind us. We were in Russo's auto shop at last, but the cost had been high, and I had no idea if the sanctuary I'd promised would live up to our desperate hopes. The interior of Russo's auto shop was dark and quiet. I found the emergency flashlight Tony always kept by the back door and switched it on, sweeping the beam across familiar surroundings now transformed by context. The hydraulic lifts, tool cabinets, and half-disassembled engines that had once represented honest work now looked like artifacts from a vanished civilization. Spread out, I instructed. Search for infected, but stay in pairs. Coach, secure the front garage doors. I led Jamal toward the stairs that connected to the apartment above. The rest of you, look for anything useful. Food, medical supplies, tools that could be weapons. Tony had lived alone in the two-bedroom apartment above his shop. The space was cluttered but comfortable, with car magazines stacked on coffee tables and framed vintage auto advertisements on the walls. Everything looked untouched, as if he might walk in any moment complaining about a difficult customer. Except he wouldn't. He was lying outside with his skull crushed by my hand. I pushed the thought away, focusing on the immediate needs of our group. Looks clear, Jamal reported after checking the second bedroom. Place has good sight lines, too. Windows on all sides, so we can see what's coming. I nodded, opening cabinets in the kitchen. Some canned food, pasta, rice. Not enough for 15 people long term, but it will supplement what we brought. I found a first aid kit under the bathroom sink and a half-empty bottle of whiskey in a cabinet. The latter I pocketed without comment. Some nights would require artificial comfort. We regrouped downstairs. Coach had secured the rolling garage doors with the internal locks and was checking the regular entrance. Front solid, he reported. Metal security gate is down and locked. They can see us through it, but they can't get to us without making a lot of noise. The shop and apartment combined gave us more space than we'd had at the school, but with 15 people, it would still be cramped. We set up a makeshift medical area in one corner of the garage where Lisa's ankle could be elevated and properly wrapped. Sophia immediately took charge, revealing she'd been a nursing student before the outbreak. It's a bad sprain, not broken, she diagnosed after examination. She needs to stay off it for at least a week. A week in which Lisa would be essentially immobile in a world where mobility meant survival. The unspoken implication hung heavy in the air. Miguel, Sophia's brother, sat nearby, pale and quiet. I knelt beside him. "How are you doing on insulin?" I asked directly. There was no point in euphemisms now. 3 days' worth, he replied, voice small but steady. 4, if I'm careful. Another clock ticking down. I squeezed his shoulder and moved away, not making promises I wasn't sure I could keep. The garage had small windows set high in the walls, providing limited light but also limited visibility for the infected outside. Through them, I could see figures still milling about the front of the shop, occasionally pressing against the metal security gate when they caught glimpses of movement inside. "We need to do a complete inventory," I announced to the group. "Everything we have. Everything we need. Jamal, show me where Tony kept the forge equipment." In the back corner of the shop, partially separated by a partition wall, was Tony's pride and joy, a traditional coal forge he'd installed to do custom metalwork for restoration projects. Next to it stood an anvil, hammers of various sizes, tongs, a quenching tank, and racks of metal stock. "This will work," I said, relief flooding through me. At least in this I hadn't misled them. "With this, we can make or repair almost anything metal. Tools, weapons, even medical instruments if necessary." Jamal ran his hand over the anvil's smooth surface. "You really think this will make a difference? That we can survive this?" I met his eyes directly. "I think it gives us a chance, more than most people have right now." I didn't sugarcoat it. "The world as we knew it is gone, Jamal. But humans are adaptable. We've survived catastrophes before. The skills I taught you, that this equipment represents, people lived with just these things for thousands of years." He nodded slowly, absorbing this perspective. "So we become blacksmiths in the apocalypse." "Among other things," I agreed. "Knowledge is what separates us from them now. The ability to create rather than just consume." We spent the rest of that day organizing our new home. The apartment would house the younger students and those with injuries or medical needs. The rest of us would sleep in the garage, taking watches in rotation. We improvised privacy screens from mechanics' drop cloths and distributed the available bedding as fairly as possible. As evening approached, Sophia examined the shop's first aid supplies with growing concern. "There's not much here," she reported. "Basic wound care, some over-the-counter pain relievers, nothing that will help Miguel long-term." "There's a pharmacy 3 blocks north," Deshawn offered. "My aunt works there." "Worked there," he corrected himself, the past tense an acknowledgement of our new reality. "We can't risk another journey so soon," Coach argued. "Everyone's exhausted, and it will be dark soon." He was right, but the insulin problem wouldn't solve itself. "Tomorrow," I decided, "we'll send a small group at first light, just enough people to move quickly and carry what we need." That night I took the first watch with Jamal. We sat near the small windows, peering out at the darkened street. The infected were still visible, silhouettes moving without purpose in the faint moonlight. "Why do you think they stay active at night?" Jamal asked quietly. "In the movies, zombies usually follow basic instincts like real animals. Most predators rest at night unless they have good night vision." It was a good question, showing the analytical mind I'd always appreciated in him. "I don't think they're driven by predatory instinct," I replied. "At least not entirely. Whatever this infection is, it seems to override normal biological functions. They don't sleep, don't seem to get tired. I'm not sure they even need to eat to keep moving." "So, what drives them? Why attack us at all?" I shook my head. "Spread. The infection wants to spread. That's all." I had no scientific basis for this theory, but it felt right. The single-minded determination of the infected, their complete disregard for self-preservation, it all pointed to an organism focused solely on replication. We lapsed into silence, each lost in our own thoughts. Eventually Jamal spoke again. "I keep thinking about Marcus and Mr. Russo, how quickly they changed. Try not to dwell on it, I advised, though I was guilty of the same rumination. Focus on what we can control. Tomorrow, we need that medicine run. The day after, we should start working the forge, see what we can create. I've been thinking about that, Jamal said, his voice gaining animation. We could modify some of the shop tools into better weapons. The pneumatic impact wrenches could be adapted for close combat, and there's steel stock we could forge into spear points or knife blades. I smiled despite our grim situation. This was why I taught, to see young minds apply knowledge in creative ways. Draw up some designs. We'll work on them together. The night passed without major incident. Occasional thumps against the security gate punctuated the darkness, but the shop's defenses held. At dawn, I gathered a small team for the pharmacy run. Myself, Deshawn, for his knowledge of the layout, and Sophia for her medical training. We move fast, stay quiet, and take only what we need, I instructed. Priority is insulin for Miguel, antibiotics, pain medication, and wound care supplies. I turned to Coach Alvarez. If we're not back by noon, secure the building and assume we're not coming back. He nodded gravely. Be careful out there. I'd selected our 3 best weapons, my metal staff, a crowbar for Deshawn, and a machete-like blade we'd found in Tony's storage room for Sophia. We each carried empty backpacks for the supplies. We exited through the back delivery entrance, the same one we'd used to enter. Tony's body was gone. Something had dragged it away during the night, which raised disturbing questions about the infected I chose not to voice. Instead, I led our small group down the alley, moving with greater caution but also more confidence than yesterday. We were learning the rules of this new world, developing instincts for survival. The pharmacy stood on a corner, its large glass windows broken. Not a good sign. We approached from the rear, using parked cars as cover. The back door was ajar, another bad omen. Stay close, I whispered, in and out, 5 minutes maximum. The interior was dark and chaotic. Shelves had been overturned, products scattered across the floor. The dispensary counter at the back remained largely intact, though drawers had been pulled out and searched. Deshawn led us directly to the prescription area. My aunt kept the insulin in the refrigerated section, he explained, pointing to a small medical refrigerator. The power was out, of course, but when Sophia checked the contents, she gave a relieved nod. Still viable, she confirmed. It hasn't been without refrigeration long enough to degrade. She quickly packed several vials into her bag, along with syringes and alcohol swabs. I stood guard while they gathered antibiotics, pain medications, and wound care supplies. 4 minutes had passed without incident, and I was beginning to think we might actually complete the mission without confrontation. Then came the crash from the front of the store. I spun toward the sound, staff raised. 3 infected had entered through the broken windows, drawn perhaps by our movement or voices. Behind them, I could see more figures on the street, heads turning toward the pharmacy. Time to go, I said tersely. Back door now. We moved quickly toward the rear exit, but not quickly enough. One of the infected, a woman in a postal worker's uniform, spotted us and let out a moan that immediately drew the attention of the others. They shambled toward us with surprising speed. Deshawn reacted first, swinging his crowbar into the nearest one's head. It fell, but the other 2 kept coming. Sophia, despite her lack of combat experience, managed to fend one off with her machete long enough for me to finish it with my staff. The 3rd grabbed at my backpack. I spun away, but not before feeling something tear. I dispatched it quickly, but the damage was done. More infected were streaming through the front entrance, drawn by the commotion. Run, I ordered. We burst through the back door into the alley, only to find 2 more infected waiting. No time for finesse now. I swung my staff in a wide arc, creating enough space for us to squeeze past. Back to the shop. Don't stop for anything." We ran, the sounds of pursuit close behind us. The 3 blocks back to Russo's felt like miles. My lungs burned, muscles screaming from exertion and yesterday's efforts. Beside me, Sophia and Deshawn were similarly taxed, but fear drove us forward. The delivery entrance came into view, and with it, a horrifying sight. The keypad had been smashed, wires dangling from the wall. Someone or something had attempted to gain entry in our absence. "The front," I gasped. "We have to go around." We changed course, hearing the moans growing closer behind us. Rounding the corner to the front of the shop, we saw Coach Alvarez peering through a gap in the security gate. His eyes widened at the sight of us being pursued. "Open it!" I shouted. "Quickly!" The security gate began to rise, agonizingly slow on its electric motor. We dropped to our knees and rolled under as soon as the gap was wide enough. The infected just steps behind us. Coach slammed the button to lower the gate, which closed just as the first infected reached it. Inside, we collapsed, gasping for breath. The mission had been successful. We had the insulin and other supplies we needed. But the close call reminded us how fragile our survival remained, how thin the line between life and death had become. "What happened to the back entrance?" I asked when I could speak again. "Someone tried to break in about an hour after you left," Jamal explained. "Not infected, regular people. 3 of them. They had tools, knew what they were doing. We scared them off with some noise, made them think we had guns. Human raiders already. I shouldn't have been surprised. In any collapse, some turn to predation immediately. We need better security," I said, "and weapons that will actually keep people at a distance." That night, as the others slept, I stood alone by Tony's forge. I ran my hands over the tools, feeling their solid reality, their potential. With these, we could create what we needed to survive. With knowledge and skill, we might forge a future from the ruins of the past. I stoked the forge for the first time, watching the coals glow orange, then white hot. Tomorrow, we would begin the real work of rebuilding. The world had ended, yes, but perhaps something new could rise from its ashes, tempered in fire like the steel we would shape. Morning came with new purpose. I gathered everyone in the main garage area for what felt like the first official day of our new existence. The initial panic of survival was giving way to something more structured, more intentional. We needed organization if we were going to last. "First order of business is a complete inventory," I announced. "Everything we have, everything we need. Tanya, you managed our supplies at the school. I'd like you to continue that role here." The girl nodded, clearly pleased to have defined responsibilities. "I'll need help counting everything," she said, looking around at the others. "Take Elena and Miguel with you," I suggested. "Coach and I will assess security needs. Jamal, I want you to help me evaluate the forge equipment and metal stock. The rest of you start organizing living spaces and sanitation." Breaking into smaller teams gave everyone purpose, which I was beginning to understand was as important as physical safety. Humans need meaning, especially in crisis. Without it, despair creeps in quickly. At the forge, Jamal and I took inventory of Tony's supplies. He had been well stocked: coal for the forge, various types of steel stock, tools for every aspect of metalworking. Most importantly, he had a hand-cranked blower for the forge, meaning we could work even without electricity. "We should start with defensive improvements," I suggested. "Reinforcements for the doors and windows. Better weapons." Jamal ran his hand along a length of steel bar. "What about that?" He pointed to a large truck engine block suspended from a chain hoist. "Could we use that for power somehow? Maybe rig it to generate electricity?" I studied the engine thoughtfully. It was from an older model, simpler than modern vehicles with their complex electronics. Maybe. I know the basics of engine mechanics, but this would be a major project. I could help, offered a voice behind us. We turned to see one of the younger students, Zach, a sophomore I knew mostly from hallway interactions. My dad runs an auto salvage yard. I've been rebuilding engines since I was 10. This was the kind of discovery that could make the difference between mere survival and actually rebuilding. Everyone had knowledge, skills that might seem useless in normal life but could be crucial now. The trick was identifying and utilizing them. "Show me what you know," I said, gesturing to the engine. While Zach explained the engine's potential to Jamal, I began work on our first forge project, reinforcing the damaged back entrance. Using steel plate from Tony's stock, I cut and shaped metal brackets that could secure the door independently of the electronic keypad. The familiar work centered me. The rhythm of hammer on metal, the focus required to shape steel precisely. These things had always brought me peace. Now they also brought security for our group. By midday, we had a clearer picture of our situation. Tanya reported on supplies. Food for about 2 weeks if we're careful. Water is a concern. The taps are still running, but pressure is weak. Medical supplies are better after yesterday's run, but we'll need more eventually. Coach Alvarez had assessed our perimeter. Front is secure with the rolling security gates. Back door is vulnerable, but we're fixing that. Side windows are small, but could be broken through with enough effort. We should board them up. I nodded, adding these tasks to our mental list. What about the noise from the forge? Will it attract infected? We tested it while you were working, Deshawn reported. Sound doesn't carry much outside the building. The walls are thick concrete. Good news, at least. I turned to Sophia next. How's Miguel doing? Stable, she replied. The insulin will last longer than he thought, maybe 2 weeks with careful rationing. But we'll need more eventually. Always more needs, always more challenges. But we were adapting hour by hour. That afternoon, a new opportunity presented itself unexpectedly. Jamal and I were working at the forge when the radio coach had been monitoring crackled to life. A voice, distant but clear enough. To anyone hearing this broadcast, we have established a trading post at the East Hills Shopping Center. Security, food, medicine, fair trade only, no charity. Broadcast daily at noon. The room fell silent as we absorbed this information. East Hills was about 3 miles from our location. Not an impossible journey, but not an easy one either through infected-filled streets. Could be a trap, Coach said, voicing the suspicion we all felt. Or it could be legitimate, I countered. Either way, it's worth investigating. Not today, but soon. If there are other organized groups out there, we need to know about them. The radio message sparked intense debate among our group. Some, like Deshawn, were eager to make contact with other survivors. Others, particularly those who had seen the attempted break-in, were wary of any outside interactions. We vote, I finally said. This affects everyone, so everyone gets a say. Democracy in the apocalypse. Perhaps civilization wasn't entirely lost after all. The vote was narrowly in favor of investigating the trading post, but not immediately. We would wait 2 days, improve our defenses and weapons, and then send a small scouting party. That evening, I began teaching a more formal metalworking class to anyone interested. 7 students gathered around the forge, watching as I demonstrated the basics of heating steel, hammer techniques, and simple shaping. The principles are straightforward, I explained, pulling a glowing piece of steel from the coals. Heat makes the metal more malleable. Hammering shapes it. Quenching in water or oil hardens it. The key is knowing when the metal is the right temperature, which you learn from its color. Jamal already knew much of this from my classes, but he watched intently anyway, occasionally helping the younger students understand. He had a natural teacher's instinct, something I hadn't fully appreciated before. "Tomorrow, each of you will make something useful," I told them. "A knife, a tool, a hook for hanging supplies, whatever we need." Zach, meanwhile, had made progress on the engine project. "If we can mount it securely and connect it to an alternator, we could generate enough power for lights at least. Maybe even recharge batteries." "Make a list of what you need," I told him. "We'll look for parts on our scouting mission." That night I took watch with Sophia. We sat near the front security gate where we could observe the street without being easily seen. The number of infected outside had diminished somewhat, many having wandered away without stimuli to hold their attention. "You're good with them," Sophia said after a while. "The kids, they trust you." I shrugged. I was their teacher. That relationship means something, even now. It's more than that. You give them purpose, direction. She looked at me appraisingly. That's rare in any situation, let alone this one. Her words made me uncomfortable. I hadn't asked to be a leader, hadn't wanted that responsibility. I'd just done what seemed necessary at each step. "What about you?" I deflected. "How are you holding up?" She gazed out at the darkened street. "I keep thinking about my parents. They were in Philadelphia when this started. I tried calling, but couldn't get through." Her voice remained steady, but her hands trembled slightly. "I know the odds." I didn't offer false hope. We both understood the reality of our situation. Instead, I said, "Miguel is lucky to have you. You've kept him alive." "For now," she whispered. "But what happens when the insulin runs out for good? This isn't a condition that goes away." The question hung between us, impossible to answer satisfactorily. In the old world, chronic medical conditions were manageable. In this new reality, they could be death sentences, unless we could find sustainable solutions. "We'll figure it out," I said finally. "There must be hospitals, pharmaceutical warehouses with supplies, or maybe the trading post will have connections." She nodded, but I could tell she wasn't convinced. Neither was I, but giving up wasn't an option. Dawn brought a surprise visitor. Coach Alvarez woke me urgently, his voice low but tense. "Someone's at the front gate, just one person, not infected." I grabbed my staff and followed him to the front. Through the gaps in the security gate, I could see a man in his 50s, gray-haired and tired-looking. He carried a backpack and had his hands raised non-threateningly. "I heard you have a forge," he called when he saw me. "I'm a doctor. I need medical tools. I can trade knowledge, services." I studied him warily. "What kind of tools?" "Scalpels, forceps, retractors, basic surgical instruments. The hospital ones are getting dull, and we have no way to sterilize new ones properly without heat. A doctor who could perform surgery would be invaluable. But caution had kept us alive so far." "How do I know you're really a doctor?" He smiled thinly. "Ask me to identify the major arteries in the human body, or describe an appendectomy procedure. Or I could examine your injured people. The girl with the sprained ankle, for instance. I can tell from how she's moving that it's a lateral sprain, likely involving the anterior talofibular ligament." I looked at Coach Alvarez, who shrugged slightly. We needed medical expertise, especially with Miguel's condition, but trust was a luxury we couldn't afford to give freely. "Wait there," I told the man. "We need to discuss this." I gathered our core group, Coach, Jamal, Sophia, and Deshawn, for a quick consultation. "If he's legitimate, he could be a major asset," I said, "but it could also be a ploy to get inside." "Let me talk to him," Sophia suggested. "I've had enough medical training to know if he's faking." We agreed to a compromise. The doctor, who introduced himself as Alan Chen, would be allowed into the outer garage area only. Sophia would question him, and he would examine Lisa's ankle under close supervision. The inner doors would remain secured, with Coach and Deshawn standing guard. Dr. Chen proved his credentials convincingly. His assessment of Lisa's injury was professional and thorough, and he answered Sophia's technical questions with ease. More importantly, he seemed genuinely interested in helping. "I've got a small clinic set up about a mile from here," he explained. "4 other medical professionals treating whoever we can. But our equipment is limited, and we're completely out of some essentials." "Why come to us specifically?" I asked, still cautious. Word gets around. "The group that tried to break in here a few days ago mentioned a forge when they came to us for treatment. I thought it might be worth investigating. So our reputation was spreading already. I wasn't sure if that was good or bad. If I make these tools for you," I said, "what do we get in return? Medical care when you need it. Advice, expertise." He hesitated, then added, "and information. We monitor radio frequencies, keep track of which areas are safer, which have been overrun. Knowledge is currency now." He was right about that. I made my decision. "I'll make your tools. Give me the specifications and come back tomorrow. But this isn't a free pass into our sanctuary. We meet outside or in the outer garage only, for now." Dr. Chen seemed to understand. Trust is earned. I respect that. He pulled a notebook from his pocket and sketched several instruments, noting dimensions and material requirements. Stainless steel would be ideal, but any high-carbon steel will work if we can keep it from rusting. After he left, the forge became a surgical instrument workshop. I selected the finest steel Tony had available and began the delicate work of crafting tools that could save lives. The first scalpel blade emerged from my efforts by evening. Smaller and more precise than anything I'd made before, its edge honed to razor sharpness. Looking at it, I felt a strange mix of pride and sorrow. In the world before, I had taught students to create art and practical objects. Now I was forging implements for surgery in a world without hospitals. The knife blade caught the light, gleaming with potential, to heal or to harm, depending on whose hands held it. Like so many things in our new reality, its purpose would be determined by the choices we made with the skills we possessed. I spent most of the night working on Dr. Chen's surgical instruments. By morning, I had completed a basic set: 3 scalpels of different sizes, forceps, retractors, and a bone saw. The precision work strained my skills, but the results were functional, if not beautiful. When I finally collapsed into sleep just before dawn, my dreams were filled with glowing metal and the rhythmic ring of hammer on steel. Jamal woke me a few hours later. "Mr. H, we need to go scavenging. Food supplies are lower than we thought." I blinked away exhaustion, forcing myself to full awareness. What happened? Some cans were bulging. Tanya thinks they were contaminated, maybe spoiled before we even got here. She threw them out to be safe. A wise decision, but it accelerated our timeline. Food had just become an immediate priority. "Gather a team," I told him. 4 people, our best fighters. We'll check the grocery store 5 blocks west. Within an hour, we were ready. The team consisted of myself, Jamal, Deshawn, and Coach Alvarez. We had our usual weapons, plus a new addition, a homemade spear I'd forged overnight with a barbed tip that would be more effective against the infected. "We leave through the back, move quickly, stay together," I instructed. "If we get separated, return to the shop immediately. Don't wait, don't play hero." Jamal nodded toward the surgical instruments laid out on a workbench. "What about the doctor? He's supposed to come back today." "Sophia will handle the exchange." Small items like these can be passed through the gate without opening it fully. I trusted her judgment, and the arrangement minimized risk. We headed out into the morning light. The streets were quieter than I'd expected. Fewer infected roamed openly, though whether that meant a decrease in their numbers or just a change in behavior, I couldn't tell. We moved cautiously anyway, alert for any movement. The grocery store loomed ahead, its large glass frontage shattered in places. Shopping carts lay abandoned in the parking lot, some still containing unpacked groceries from when panic first hit. We approached from the side using the loading dock entrance that would be less exposed. "This feels too easy," Coach muttered as we slipped inside without encountering resistance. I shared his unease. Nothing had been easy since the outbreak began. Inside, the store was what you'd expect, partially looted, with scattered merchandise and evidence of panicked departures. But strangely, large sections remained untouched. The produce section had rotted into a foul-smelling mess, but canned goods, pasta, rice, staples with long shelf lives were still abundantly available on many shelves. "Grab everything nutritionally dense," I instructed, passing out the empty backpacks we'd brought. "Protein sources first, then carbohydrates. Focus on canned foods with pull tabs so we don't need can openers." We worked methodically, filling our bags with surprising efficiency. The abundance was almost disorienting after days of strict rationing. It raised an obvious question that Coach finally voiced. Why hasn't this place been completely cleaned out already? The answer came moments later in the form of a deafening crash from the front of the store. We froze, weapons raised, as a group of figures moved through the broken front entrance. Not infected. Their movements were too coordinated, too purposeful. These were survivors, at least 6 of them, armed with an assortment of makeshift weapons. "Get down," I hissed, pulling Jamal behind a display shelf. Coach and Deshaun ducked behind the butcher counter. "I'm telling you, I heard something," a male voice carried across the store. "Someone's in here." "Spread out," another voice commanded. "Anyone you find, bring them to me. We need more workers for the warehouse." The implication was clear and chilling. These weren't friendly survivors looking to trade or cooperate. They were hunting for people to capture. I caught Coach's eye across the aisle and signaled toward the loading dock. He nodded, understanding my intent. We needed to retreat without confrontation. We began moving slowly backward, staying low behind the aisles. We'd almost reached the back when Deshaun knocked over a can, sending it rolling loudly across the tile floor. "There," a voice shouted, "back corner." No choice now. "Run," I ordered, abandoning stealth for speed. We sprinted for the loading dock door, but 2 of the hunters appeared at the end of our aisle, cutting off our escape route. What followed was chaos. Deshaun swung his crowbar at the nearest attacker, connecting solidly with the man's shoulder. I engaged the second with my staff, managing to force him back temporarily. Coach and Jamal circled to flank them. "Behind you," Coach shouted. I spun to see 3 more hunters approaching from the side aisle. We were being surrounded. "New plan," I called. "Front exit. Go." We changed direction, fighting our way toward the main entrance. I took a glancing blow to the ribs that knocked the wind from me, but managed to keep moving. Jamal's new spear proved devastatingly effective, the barbed tip catching in the flesh of an attacker's thigh and bringing him down with a scream. We burst through the front doors into daylight, only to find our path blocked again. A tall man with a shotgun stood beside a modified pickup truck. Behind him, 2 figures knelt on the ground, hands bound. "Well now," the man said, leveling the shotgun at us. "Looks like we found some more recruits." I assessed our situation rapidly. The man with the shotgun was the obvious leader. The 2 bound captives seemed to be in their 20s, a man and a woman. Behind us, the rest of the hunting party was emerging from the store. We were outnumbered and outgunned, but not outthought. "We have a forge," I said, lowering my staff slightly but keeping it ready. "We can make tools, weapons, repair metal objects." The leader's expression changed subtly. "A blacksmith? Working forge?" He seemed skeptical but interested. "Industrial arts teacher before all this. Now I run a forge at an auto shop nearby. These are my apprentices." I gestured to Jamal and the others. "We came for food. We're willing to trade our services." The leader studied me, weighing profit against risk. "Show me your hands," he demanded. I extended them, palms up. The calluses and burn scars from years of metalworking told their own story. "What kind of metalwork?" "Anything you need. Weapons, tools, vehicle repairs." I gestured to his truck. "That front bumper is coming loose. I could reinforce it, make it more effective for clearing streets." His eyes narrowed. "And why would you help us instead of ending up like these two?" He kicked one of the kneeling captives. "Because skilled labor has value," I replied steadily. "You can force people to work for you, but they'll never be as productive as those who work through mutually beneficial arrangement. We need food. You need metalwork. Simple exchange." The leader seemed to consider this. For a long, tense moment, I thought he might simply shoot us and take his chances, forcing us to work. Then he lowered the shotgun slightly. "All right, Blacksmith. We'll try your way. For now." He turned to his men. "Let them keep their supplies. We'll escort them back to this forge, see if they're telling the truth." Not ideal, but better than being captured or killed. I nodded agreement, though my stomach churned at the thought of leading these predators back to our sanctuary, to the children and injured we'd sworn to protect. As we began walking, the leader fell in beside me. "Name's Garrett," he said. "I run the warehouse district now." "Demetrius," I replied simply. "Your people at this forge. How many?" I considered lying, but if he was going to see for himself, better to be consistent. 15. Mostly kids, my students. Some injured. Garrett processed this information with a calculating look. "And they're all as loyal to you as these three?" He gestured to Coach, Jamal, and Deshaun, who walked ahead under guard. "They've survived this long by following my lead," I said, neither confirming nor denying. We approached Russo's auto shop from the front, giving me time to signal our situation to those watching inside. I hoped Sophia would understand what was happening, would secure the most vulnerable members of our group upstairs. At the security gate, I entered the code while Garrett and his men watched closely. The gate rose, revealing the garage interior. I stepped inside first. "This is Garrett," I announced to the wide-eyed faces inside. "He and his people control the warehouse district. They're here to discuss a trading arrangement." Sophia stood near the stairs, her body positioned to block access to the upper floor. Smart woman. Her eyes met mine, questioning. I gave a subtle nod, trying to convey caution but not immediate danger. Garrett surveyed the garage, his gaze lingering on the forge setup in the corner. "Impressive," he admitted. "You weren't lying about that, at least." "I rarely lie," I replied. "Bad for business relationships." His men spread out, examining our space with predatory interest. One approached the stairs, but Sophia didn't budge. "Medical area," she said firmly. "Patients with infectious conditions are quarantined upstairs. You don't want to go up there." A clever bluff. The man hesitated, looking to Garrett for instruction. "Leave it," Garrett ordered. "We're here for the forge, not plague." He turned back to me. "Show me what you can do, Blacksmith." I moved to the forge, lighting it with practiced ease. While the coals heated, I selected a piece of steel bar stock. "What would you like me to make?" "Something simple, as a demonstration." "A knife," he said. "Something that will hold an edge." I nodded and began working, aware of all eyes on me. The familiar process centered me despite the tension. I heated the steel to a glowing orange, hammered it to shape, reheated, refined the edge, then quenched it in oil. In under 30 minutes, I'd produced a serviceable blade with a tang ready for a handle. Garrett took it, testing the edge with his thumb. "Good work," he acknowledged. "Better than anything we've got." "That's just a quick demonstration," I said. "With proper time and materials, I can make much better. Weapons, tools, armor, vehicle modifications." He handed the knife back. "Finish it. Put a handle on it." I wrapped the tang in leather cord for a grip, securing it with a metal pommel cap. The finished knife was simple but functional, the kind of tool that would be invaluable in our new world. Garrett took it again, this time slipping it into his belt. "Here's how this works, Blacksmith. You and your forge are now under my protection. You make what we need, we provide food and security, your people stay safe." The offer was clear. Vassalage, not partnership. I glanced at Coach Alvarez, whose tight expression told me he was thinking the same thing I was. We couldn't accept such terms, but direct refusal would likely trigger violence. "We appreciate the offer," I said carefully, "but we've established good trading relationships with several groups already, including a medical clinic. Exclusivity would hurt all parties involved." Garrett's expression darkened. That wasn't a request. Before he could continue, a tremendous crash came from outside. All heads turned toward the sound. Through the security gate, we could see a city maintenance truck had plowed into several vehicles on the street, creating a barricade. Behind it, dozens of infected were pouring into the area, drawn by the noise. "What the hell?" one of Garrett's men exclaimed. I moved quickly to the control panel, lowering the security gate before the infected could reach it. "Looks like we have a common problem now," I observed. "Those things will be swarming this area for hours after a noise like that." Garrett glared at me suspiciously. "Convenient timing." I spread my hands. "Nothing to do with us. We've been in here with you." It was true. None of our people had triggered this. But I silently thanked whatever chaos of the apocalypse had created this diversion. Garrett assessed the situation with cold calculation. "We'll continue this discussion later," he said finally. "My men and I will clear a path back to our vehicles." He pointed at me. "But don't think this is over. You're a resource now, Blacksmith. My resource." They left through the back entrance, forced to fight their way through scattered infected drawn by the commotion out front. When they were gone, the tension in the room broke like a fever. "That was too close," Coach said, wiping sweat from his brow. "He would have taken over completely." I nodded grimly. "And he'll be back. With more men next time." I looked around at our group, at the sanctuary we'd created. We need to prepare. Because now we're not just fighting the infected, we're fighting other survivors too. The encounter with Garrett's group changed everything. We were no longer anonymous survivors in a dead city. We were a resource, a target. The forge that had been our salvation now painted a bullseye on our backs. That night, as others slept, I stood at the anvil, hammer in hand, forging not tools or surgical instruments but weapons. The rhythm of steel on steel marked the beginning of a new phase in our struggle, one where the greatest threats might come from the living rather than the dead. The night after Garrett's visit, we held our first formal council meeting. Everyone gathered in the garage, sitting on whatever makeshift seats we could arrange. Even Lisa, with her injured ankle, insisted on attending. The mood was somber, determined. "We have 3 immediate concerns," I began. "First, Garrett and his group will return, probably with more force. Second, our food supplies are adequate for now but won't last forever. Third, we need better defenses against both infected and human threats. Coach Alvarez leaned forward. We should consider relocating. This place is known now. Garrett's people know where we are, and he's made his intentions clear. Several voices rose in agreement, but Jamal shook his head. Where would we go? The forge can't be moved easily. Without it, we lose our main advantage. Besides, Sophia added, Miguel's condition requires stability. Moving risks complications, especially with unknown territory. The debate continued with valid points on both sides. Eventually, I raised my hand for quiet. I understand the impulse to run, but Jamal's right. The forge is our greatest asset. Instead of abandoning it, we need to transform this place from a target into a stronghold. I outlined my proposal. We would fortify our defenses, yes, but more importantly, we would establish ourselves as a trading hub. Instead of working exclusively for Garrett's group or hiding from them, we would become too valuable for anyone to risk destroying. The doctor already values our services, I explained. There must be other groups out there with different resources, different skills. We create a marketplace here, neutral ground where trades can happen safely. You want to invite strangers in? Deshawn asked incredulously. After what just happened? Not inside our secure areas, I clarified. We set up a trading space in the front lot. Limited access, controlled environment. We provide metalwork that no one else can offer. Others bring what they have. Food, medicine, information, labor. Coach looked skeptical. And what stops someone like Garrett from just taking over? Community interest, I replied. If we become a central trading hub, multiple groups will have a stake in our continued independence. Attack us, and you make enemies of everyone who relies on our services. It was ambitious, perhaps naive, but no one had a better alternative. We voted and agreed to implement the plan, starting immediately with increased fortifications. The next morning, Dr. Chen returned for his surgical instruments. I met him at the gate as planned, but instead of simply handing over the tools, I invited him inside to inspect them properly. His eyes widened at the quality of my work. These are better than I expected, he admitted, testing a scalpel's edge. The balance is good, the edges precise. I have a proposal for you, doctor, I said, explaining our marketplace concept. Your clinic has medical knowledge and supplies. We have metalworking. Others will have different resources. Together, we can create something more sustainable than just surviving day to day. Chen considered this thoughtfully. It could work. There's a group near the river with an agricultural project starting, growing food on rooftops. They come to us for treatment sometimes. And the radio operators at the old broadcasting tower have information about conditions throughout the region. Would you help us contact them? Establish initial connections? He nodded slowly. I could. But what about Garrett's people? Everyone knows they control the warehouse district, and they're not known for sharing. We'll deal with that when the time comes, I said, not entirely sure how, but knowing we'd have to find a way. For now, we need to establish our value to as many groups as possible. Over the next 2 days, we transformed the auto shop and surrounding area. Zach and a team got the truck engine working as a generator, providing limited electricity for essential functions. Jamal and I worked nearly non-stop at the forge, creating improved weapons, tools, and defensive reinforcements. Word spread faster than I would have thought possible in a world without phones or internet. Dr. Chen was true to his word, reaching out to the groups he knew. By the 3rd day after Garrett's visit, we had our first official trading partners, the rooftop farmers Chen had mentioned, who arrived with fresh vegetables in exchange for metal tools that would improve their operation. Their leader, a former environmental science professor named Layla, was cautiously optimistic about our marketplace idea. "Communities form naturally around resources," she observed as we inspected the tools I'd made. "Water, food, security. You've created a new essential resource, the ability to make things that can't be scavenged. Will you spread the word to others you trust?" I asked. She nodded. "There's a group of former dock workers who've been fishing the river. They could use better hooks and tools. I'll tell them about your setup here." By the end of the week, we'd established regular trading relationships with 5 distinct survivor groups, each with different specialties. The radio operators provided information about safe and dangerous areas of the city. The dock workers brought fish. A group of former campus security guards offered protection during trading hours. Each transaction reinforced our value to the emerging network of survivors. Jamal thrived in this new environment, showing a natural talent not just for metalwork, but for innovation. He developed a system for creating fishing hooks from scrap metal that was far more efficient than my original method. The dock workers were so impressed they offered him an apprenticeship, which he politely declined. "I already have a mentor," he told me later, with a hint of pride that made my chest tight with emotion. One afternoon, as I worked on a custom knife blade at the forge, Jamal approached with a design sketched on scrap paper. "I've been thinking about what you said about making something for Marcus." He showed me the drawing, a simple but elegant medallion with interlocking gears etched into the surface. "It's beautiful," I said, genuinely impressed. "A memorial piece?" He nodded. "For everyone we've lost. I thought maybe we could make one for each person, hang them somewhere as a reminder." "You should do it," I told him, "as your first solo project. I'll guide you, but this should be yours." The pride in his eyes was worth every hardship we'd endured. In that moment, I remembered why I became a teacher in the first place: to witness the growth of young minds, to help shape potential into skill. Even in this broken world, that fundamental purpose remained. Later that day, as the marketplace wound down for the evening, Sophia found me inspecting a basket of apples we'd traded for a set of garden tools. "Miguel's blood sugar has been more stable with the fresh food," she reported. "But we need to talk about the insulin situation." I set down the apple I'd been examining. "How much is left?" "Maybe 10 days' worth, even with stretching it." Her voice was steady, but I could see the fear behind her professional demeanor. "The pharmacy supplies won't last forever." I've been thinking about this problem already. The trading post at East Hill Shopping Center that we heard about on the radio, they mentioned medical supplies. Now that we have reliable trading partners, it might be time to investigate. Sophia nodded cautiously. "It's risky, but necessary. When do we go?" "Tomorrow," I decided. "We'll send a small team. You for medical knowledge, me, and maybe one of the security guards who's been helping with the marketplace, someone who knows the area well." As night fell, I took watch on the roof with Coach Alvarez. The stars were brilliant in the absence of city lights, a beauty that seemed almost offensive against the backdrop of collapse below. "You've created something remarkable here," Coach said after a while. "In less than a week, you've gone from teacher to community builder." I shook my head. "We all did this together." "True, but it was your vision. The forge, the trading hub, these were your ideas." He gazed out over the darkened city. "I've been thinking about what happens next. After the immediate crisis passes, assuming we survive, what kind of world are we rebuilding?" It was a profound question, one I'd pushed aside in favor of immediate concerns. "I don't know," I admitted, "but whatever we create should be better than just a return to what was." more sustainable, more equitable. That starts with what we're doing right here, he observed. The choices we make now, the values we uphold, they're the foundation. The conversation stayed with me as I tried to sleep later. Coach was right. We weren't just surviving anymore. We were, consciously or not, laying groundwork for whatever came after. The thought was both terrifying and exhilarating. Morning brought a surprising visitor. As I prepared for the expedition to East Hills, one of our lookouts reported a single figure approaching the front gate. Not Garrett or his men, not an infected, but a woman walking openly with hands visible. I went to investigate and found myself face to face with the female captive we'd seen with Garrett days earlier, the one who had been kneeling, bound, in the parking lot. "Are you the blacksmith?" she asked without preamble. I nodded cautiously, signaling Coach to stay alert for any sign of ambush. "I escaped 2 nights ago," she continued. "Got away during a supply run. I heard about this place, about what you're building here." She straightened her shoulders. "I want to join you. I have skills. I was a structural engineer before all this. I know buildings, materials, weak points, strong points. I can help fortify this place." I studied her closely for any sign of deception. "Garrett will come looking for you." "He's going to come for you anyway," she replied bluntly. "He's been gathering men, weapons, talking about how the forge will be his. I figure I might as well be on the side with the better ethical standing when it happens." Her directness was refreshing, though her news was disturbing. "What's your name?" I asked. "Vanessa Chen," she answered. "No relation to your doctor friend, though we've met. He treated my injuries after Garrett's men caught me." That connection lent credibility to her story. Still, caution was necessary. "You understand we can't just trust you immediately." She shrugged. "I wouldn't trust me either. Keep me under watch, limit my access, whatever you need to do. But I'm telling you, Garrett is coming. Soon. And you're going to need every skilled person you can get." I made a quick decision. You can stay in the outer garage area for now, under supervision. Prove yourself useful, prove you're not a spy, and we'll reconsider. Vanessa's warning forced us to postpone the East Hills expedition. If Garrett was truly planning an imminent attack, we needed all hands preparing defenses. I sent a message to Dr. Chen through one of the marketplace traders asking him to verify Vanessa's identity and escape. The community worked with renewed urgency. Vanessa, despite her provisional status, provided valuable insights on strengthening vulnerable points in our perimeter. Jamal and I forged additional weapons, including several innovations specifically designed to keep attackers at bay. The marketplace became our intelligence network. Traders brought rumors, sightings, confirmation that Garrett's forces were indeed mobilizing. We counted at least 15 armed men in his group, possibly more, outnumbering our combat-capable members significantly. "We can't win in a direct fight," Coach stated during an emergency council meeting. "We need to make the cost of attacking us too high." Zach, who had been quietly listening, spoke up. "What if we use the shop equipment? The hydraulic lifts, the compressed air systems. We could rig traps, defensive measures." The idea had merit. Over the next 24 hours, we transformed the auto shop into a defensive maze. Pressure plates connected to air-powered mechanisms that could drop heavy objects or release pre-positioned barriers. Tripwires that would trigger blinding clouds of metal filings. Narrow choke points where defenders could engage attackers with minimal exposure. Jamal completed his memorial medallion for Marcus during this frantic preparation, working late into the night at the secondary forge station we'd set up. The finished piece was beautiful, a perfect circle of polished steel with Marcus's name and the gear design etched deeply into the surface. He hung it prominently near the forge, a reminder of why we fought so hard to preserve what we'd built. As dawn broke the next day, our lookout on the roof gave the alarm we'd been dreading, vehicles approaching from the direction of the warehouse district. Garrett had made his move. I took my position near the forge, which we'd converted into a defensive strongpoint. The heat of the coals warmed my face as I looked around at the determined expressions of my makeshift family. Students who had become warriors, strangers who had become allies, children forced to grow up too quickly in a world gone mad. "Remember," I called out as we heard engines growing closer, "we're not just fighting for ourselves. We're fighting for what comes after, for the world we're rebuilding." Jamal nodded, his young face solemn as he gripped the spear he'd forged himself. "Steel remembers," he said, echoing my words from that classroom lifetime ago. "And so will we." The first shots rang out outside, signaling the beginning of the assault. I took a deep breath, steadying my hands on the weapon I'd created. The forge fire glowed bright, ready to shape whatever future would emerge from this crucible. Garrett's attack began with a show of force. 3 vehicles, a pickup truck and 2 SUVs, pulled up outside our security gate. His men took positions behind them, weapons visible. Garrett himself stood in the bed of the pickup, megaphone in hand. "Blacksmith," his amplified voice carried easily to where we waited inside. "This can go 2 ways. You and your forge join us willingly, or we take it by force. Your choice." I approached our side of the gate, but stayed beyond easy shooting range. "We've established peaceful trading relationships with groups throughout the area," I called back. "Attack us, and you make enemies of all of them." Garrett laughed. "You think those scavengers and farmers will fight for you? They're barely surviving themselves." "Then why not join the network instead of trying to control it?" I countered. "Trade fairly for what you need. There's a place for everyone in the system we're building." For a moment I thought he might actually consider the offer. His expression flickered, showing something almost like uncertainty. Then it hardened again. "Last chance, Blacksmith. Join or burn." "We can't give you what you want," I replied simply. Garrett nodded as if he'd expected this answer. "Have it your way." He raised his hand, and his men opened fire on the security gate. We'd anticipated this. The metal security gate was reinforced with additional plating we'd forged specifically to withstand gunfire. We retreated to our defensive positions as bullets sparked harmlessly against the barrier. "First wave incoming," Coach reported from his observation post. Sure enough, Garrett sent 5 men rushing toward the gate, carrying what looked like a battering ram made from a telephone pole. "Hold positions," I ordered. Everyone tensed, waiting for the trap we'd set to trigger. The battering ram hit the gate with tremendous force, but before they could strike again, Zach activated our first defense. A hydraulic lift we'd repositioned near the entrance surged upward, catching the underside of the ram and forcing it back into the attackers. 2 went down immediately. The others retreated in confusion. Garrett hadn't expected resistance so well engineered. He regrouped his men, changing tactics. The next wave attempted to breach through the side of the building, using tools to attack the concrete blocks near a window. That was where Vanessa's knowledge proved invaluable. She'd identified this vulnerability days earlier, and we'd prepared accordingly. When they breached the wall, they found not an entry point but a choke point lined with sharpened metal and mechanized hammers that swung down when triggered. The attackers pulled back, leaving 1 wounded man behind. I could see frustration building in Garrett's gestures as he shouted at his lieutenants. "They'll try something bigger next," Vanessa predicted from her position beside me. "Probably a vehicle breach or explosives." She was right. Garrett's men began preparing their pickup truck, reinforcing the front with metal plates they'd brought. Their intention was clear: use the truck to smash through our defenses. "Ready the forged defense," I told Jamal, who nodded and moved to his position. The truck revved its engine, then accelerated toward our gate. The impact was tremendous, metal screaming against metal. The reinforced gate bent inward but held, barely. They backed up to ram again. "Now," I called to Jamal. He pulled the release on our most desperate defensive measure. We'd run a flexible metal pipe from the forge to the damaged gate, creating a crude flamethrower using the forge's bellows and fuel. A gout of flame shot through the bent gate, engulfing the front of the truck. The driver abandoned the vehicle, clothes smoldering. Behind their barricades, Garrett's men looked increasingly uncertain. This was clearly more resistance than they'd anticipated. I thought we might have turned the tide until I heard a shout from the roof. "Infected incoming," our lookout called down, dozens of them drawn by the noise. The gunfire and commotion had done exactly what we feared, attracted every infected within hearing distance. They shambled toward us from all directions, but they were approaching Garrett's position first. His men noticed too late. The first infected reached their flank, grabbing the nearest gunman. Others followed, a wave of grasping hands and snapping teeth. Garrett shouted orders, trying to maintain discipline while fighting a threat from two directions. For a moment, I considered letting the infected solve our problem for us. Garrett's force was caught in the open while we had shelter. But watching them being overwhelmed stirred something in me, a reminder of our shared humanity, however flawed. "We have to help them," I said, surprising myself. "What?" Deshawn looked at me like I'd lost my mind. "They just tried to kill us." "If we let them die, we're no better than Garrett," I insisted. "And we'll need all the living humans we can get to rebuild." Coach Alvarez studied my face, then nodded slowly. "What's the plan?" "Open the side door," I ordered. "Give them a path to retreat inside. Infected can't climb as well as humans. We can secure the upper level." It was risky, but I couldn't watch people being torn apart, even enemies. Vanessa moved to the control panel that would open our secondary entrance, while Coach and Jamal prepared to cover the retreat. "Garrett," I shouted through a gap in the damaged gate. "Fall back to our building. Side entrance is opening. We'll cover you." He stared at me in disbelief, then at the infected closing in from behind. Self-preservation won out. "Pull back," he ordered his men. "To the side door." The retreat was chaotic. Garrett's remaining men, now fewer than 10, fled toward our building while infected pursued them. We provided covering fire from defensive positions, taking down the closest threats. Not all made it. 3 of Garrett's men went down under the infected, their screams cutting off abruptly. Garrett himself was the last through the door before Vanessa sealed it shut. He stood inside our territory, breathing hard, weapon still in hand but pointed downward. Our defenders surrounded him, waiting for my word. "Why?" he asked simply, looking at me with genuine confusion. "Because we need to be better than this," I replied. "Because surviving isn't enough if we lose our humanity in the process." Something shifted in his expression. Not surrender, exactly, but reassessment. Before he could respond, a commotion from the upper level drew our attention. "Mr. H," Elena called down frantically, "it's the doctor. Something's wrong." Dr. Chen had arrived during the battle, slipping in through a prearranged signal at the rear entrance. He'd gone upstairs to check on our injured, particularly Miguel, whose insulin supplies were critically low. I rushed upstairs with Sophia, leaving Coach and the others to watch Garrett's men. In the makeshift medical area, we found Chen bending over Miguel, who was pale and unresponsive. "Diabetic shock," Chen explained tersely. "His blood sugar crashed. I've given him an emergency injection, but he needs more sustained treatment." "Will he make it?" Sophia asked, her voice tight with fear. Jen hesitated. I don't know. His system has been under strain for days with irregular insulin, and we're almost out completely. The doctor's expression was grave as he continued working on the boy. I pulled Sophia aside. We need more insulin. Now. Not tomorrow, not next week. She nodded, eyes never leaving her brother. The East Hills Trading Post. It's our only chance. I'll go, I decided immediately. You stay with Miguel. You can't go alone, she protested. It's too dangerous. I'll take volunteers. We leave as soon as the infected outside thin out. Downstairs, I found an uneasy truce had settled between our people and Garrett's survivors. They sat on one side of the garage, under guard but not restrained. I need to make a supply run, I announced. Critical medical supplies for one of our kids. Who's with me? Jamal stepped forward immediately, as did Deshawn. Before anyone else could volunteer, Garrett spoke up. I'll go. All heads turned to him in surprise. He stood, hands open in a non-threatening gesture. You saved my men when you could have let us die. That creates an obligation. His expression was unreadable. Besides, my people know the quickest routes through the eastern districts. I can get you there faster than you'd manage alone. I studied him, looking for deception. Why should I trust you? You shouldn't, he said bluntly. But right now, our interests align. You need speed. I need to repay a debt so my pride can live with it. It was a risk, but time was working against us. All right, I agreed. You, me, Jamal, and Deshawn. The rest of your men stay here under guard. Garrett nodded, accepting these terms. We'll need a vehicle. Mine is currently on fire outside your gate. We have one, I replied, in the back workshop. Tony's old delivery van. Zach's been keeping it running. As we prepared for the expedition, selecting weapons and clearing the back alley to access the van, I pulled Jamal aside. Keep your eye on him every second, I warned. This could still be a play to get us outside where we're vulnerable. I know, Jamal replied, his young face set with determination. But we have to try for Miguel. The infected had begun to disperse somewhat, drawn to other disturbances in the city. We slipped out through the back entrance, 4 unlikely allies on a desperate mission. The van started on the first try, Zach's mechanical expertise proving its worth once again. Garrett took the passenger seat, directing me through side streets and alleys I wouldn't have thought passable. True to his word, he seemed focused entirely on the fastest route to East Hills. Why the change of heart? I asked as we navigated around an overturned bus. You were ready to kill us all, an hour ago. Garrett was silent for a long moment. I've been running on survival instincts since this started. Take what you need. Control what you can. It's worked. Kept my people alive. He stared out the window at the ruined cityscape. But watching you risk yourselves for enemies made me realize something. Surviving this way, there's no end to it. No rebuilding, just endless taking until there's nothing left. I wasn't sure I believed his epiphany, but his directions were proving accurate, and we were making good time. We reached the outskirts of the East Hills area in under 20 minutes, a journey that would have taken us an hour or more without his guidance. The shopping center loomed ahead, its sprawling parking lot now a makeshift marketplace surrounded by barricades and guard posts. Numerous people moved about inside, the largest concentration of survivors I'd seen since the outbreak began. Checkpoint ahead, Garrett warned. Let me do the talking. Some of these guards know me, and not necessarily fondly. We slowed as armed figures approached our vehicle. I tensed, prepared for betrayal, but Garrett rolled down his window and called out, "Medical emergency. We need access to trade for insulin." The guards conferred briefly, then waved us through to a designated parking area. As we exited the van, I took in the scale of the operation. The trading post was far larger and more organized than our small marketplace. Different sections offered various goods: food, medicine, weapons, clothing, tools. Armed guards patrolled throughout, maintaining order. "The medical section is there," Garrett pointed to a former pharmacy at the edge of the complex. "But you'll need something valuable to trade. Insulin is premium merchandise here." I patted the bag I'd brought. "I have specialty knives, surgical-grade instruments, and I can offer forge services for future trades." We approached the medical trading area, where a middle-aged woman with a clipboard evaluated offers with clinical detachment. When I explained our need and displayed my metalwork, her expression remained neutral. "Insulin requires top-tier trade items," she stated. "The knives are good, but not sufficient for a meaningful supply." My heart sank. We hadn't come this far to fail. What would be sufficient? She considered. Ammunition, fuel, working communications equipment, none of which we had in abundance. I was about to offer future services, anything to get what Miguel needed, when Garrett stepped forward. "I have a crate of ammunition at my warehouse," he said. "Assorted calibers. I'll add it to his trade." The woman raised an eyebrow. "You're vouching for his credit, Garrett? That's unlike you." "Times change," he replied simply. "Make the deal. I'll deliver the ammunition today." She studied him for a long moment, then nodded. "Acceptable." She turned and retrieved a small cooler from a refrigerated case behind her. 4 vials. Enough for approximately 2 weeks with careful rationing. I took the cooler with trembling hands, relief washing through me. It wasn't a permanent solution, but it would keep Miguel alive while we sought more sustainable options. As we hurried back to the van, I turned to Garrett. "Thank you." He shrugged uncomfortably. "Consider us even." The return journey was tense, but uneventful. We arrived back at the forge to find the situation stable. The infected had mostly dispersed, drawn away by some disturbance elsewhere in the city. Chen immediately took the insulin upstairs to treat Miguel. Garrett gathered his remaining men. "We're leaving," he announced. "The blacksmith and I have reached an understanding." He looked at me. "My people won't trouble yours again. But this doesn't make us friends." "Allies would be more useful than friends anyway," I replied. "The trading network needs what your warehouse district can provide. There's a place for you in it, if you're willing to work with others rather than trying to control them." He considered this. "I'll think about it." After they departed, I climbed the stairs wearily to check on Miguel. Chen met me at the top, his expression cautiously positive. "He's stabilizing," the doctor reported. "The fresh insulin is working. With proper management, he should recover." Sophia sat beside her brother's bed, holding his hand. She looked up at me with tears in her eyes. "Thank you," she whispered. "I don't know how you pulled this off." "We all did," I replied. "That's how we survive now. Together." I descended to the garage floor, exhaustion finally catching up with me. The forge still glowed in the corner, its heat a constant presence. Around it, our community moved with purpose, repairing damage from the attack, tending to wounded, maintaining the life we'd built. Looking at them, these students, strangers, allies who had become something like family, I felt a fierce pride unlike anything I'd experienced in my teaching career. We had faced death and chaos, and we had forged something resilient from the ruins. The victory was temporary. I knew that. Miguel's insulin would run out again. Garrett's cooperation might not last. The infected still roamed outside. But for this moment, watching Jamal work the forge with growing confidence, seeing the memorial medallion gleaming on the wall, I allowed myself to believe that we might not just survive this apocalypse, but find a way to rebuild something worth living for on the other side. Then Elena approached, her young face grave. "Mr. H., the radio's picking up something strange. You should hear this." I followed her to where our emergency radio sat. The voice coming through the static made my blood run cold. It wasn't the usual military chatter or survivor broadcasts. It was an automated message, repeating on a loop, "Attention all survivors. Quarantine protocols have failed in sectors 7 through 12. Pittsburgh has been designated a Class 1 contamination zone. The city will be subjected to containment measures at 0600 hours. This is your final evacuation notice." Containment measures. The euphemism wasn't hard to decipher. They were planning to write off the city entirely, possibly with methods that would eliminate all life within it, infected or not. I looked at the faces around me, people who had fought so hard to survive, to build something from the ashes. We had overcome infected, hostile survivors, dwindling supplies. But this was a threat of an entirely different magnitude. "How long do we have?" Coach asked quietly. I checked the workshop clock. Less than 9 hours. The broadcast about containment measures triggered immediate action. I called everyone together, even those resting or on watch duty. No one needed to be told twice. The gravity in my voice was enough. "The military is planning to eliminate the entire city," I announced without preamble. "We have less than 9 hours to evacuate." The reactions ranged from disbelief to terror. "They can't just bomb a city," Deshawn protested. "There are still survivors here." "They can, and they will," Dr. Chen said grimly. "This follows containment protocols for worst-case pandemic scenarios. When an urban area reaches critical infection levels with no possibility of reclamation, it gets written off to protect the wider region." "What exactly are containment measures?" Sophia asked, her arm protectively around Miguel, who was still weak but conscious. Chen hesitated. "Could be aerial bombing. More likely chemical or biological agents designed to neutralize the infection by killing everything in the contamination zone." The silence that followed was deafening. We had created something miraculous here. A community, a trading hub, a place where skills and knowledge were preserved. And now we had to abandon it. "Where do we go?" Tanya voiced the question on everyone's mind. I'd been thinking about this since hearing the broadcast. The radio message mentioned sectors 7 through 12. That's the central city and east side. We're in Sector 9, but the western districts might be outside the containment zone. "The river forms a natural barrier," Coach observed. "They might use it as the containment boundary." "Exactly. If we can cross the river before morning, we might escape whatever they're planning." I turned to Chen. "Doctor, do you know of any secure locations on the west side?" He considered. "There's a hospital complex in Greentree. Substantial buildings, some with independent power systems for critical care. If it hasn't been overrun, it could be defensible." "That's our target then," I decided. "But we need to move quickly, and we need to take what we can." Jamal spoke up, his voice steady despite the fear evident in his eyes. "What about the forge?" "All our equipment." The question struck at my heart. The forge had been our salvation, the center of everything we'd built. The thought of leaving it behind felt like abandoning a piece of ourselves. "We take what we can carry," I said reluctantly. "Essential tools, the hand anvil, coal. We'll have to rebuild the rest." "I'm not sure Miguel can travel," Sophia said quietly. "He's still very weak." I met her eyes. "We'll make it work. Everyone helps. No one gets left behind." We broke into teams, each with specific responsibilities. Tanya organized food and medical supplies. Zach and his mechanical team prepped the vehicles. Tony's delivery van and a pickup truck we'd acquired through trade. Coach coordinated security and weapons distribution. I focused on salvaging essential forge equipment. The work was frantic but methodical. We'd learned efficiency through necessity over the past week. Every item was evaluated for utility versus weight and space. Hard choices had to be made with each selection. As I carefully wrapped my best hammers and tongs, Jamal approached with a determined expression. "Mr. H, I think we should take the memorial medallions." I glanced at the wall where several completed medallions now hung. One for Marcus, one for Tony Russo, others for people we'd lost along the way. They served no practical purpose, but I understood immediately why they mattered. "You're right," I agreed. "Our history, our remembrance, that's as important as any tool." Jamal carefully removed each medallion, wrapping them in cloth before placing them in his personal pack. The gesture reinforced something I'd been coming to understand. We weren't just surviving physically, we were preserving something deeper: memory, culture, the connections that make us human. 3 hours into our preparations, a new challenge emerged. The infected, perhaps sensing unusual activity, began gathering outside in greater numbers than we'd seen before. Dozens, then scores of them pressed against our barricades, making loading the vehicles increasingly dangerous. "We need a diversion," Coach said as we watched their numbers grow. "Something to draw them away long enough for everyone to get into the vehicles." It was Zach who offered a solution. The hydraulic system we rigged for defense. We could modify it to create a timed noise distraction. Set it to trigger after we're ready to leave, somewhere away from our exit route. "Can you make it work?" I asked. He nodded. "Give me an hour." While Zach worked on the diversion, the rest of us completed our preparations. The vehicles were loaded with our most essential supplies and equipment. Everyone was limited to a single pack of personal items. The hard reality of evacuation meant leaving behind most of what we'd accumulated. Dr. Chen prepared Miguel for travel, creating a makeshift stretcher that could be secured in the delivery van. "Keep him warm and minimize jostling," he instructed Sophia. "I'll ride with you to monitor his condition." As midnight approached, we gathered for a final briefing. Our plan was as solid as it could be under the circumstances. We would exit through the back alley, using Zach's diversion to draw the infected away from our route. The van would lead, carrying the most vulnerable members of our group, followed by the pickup with our heaviest equipment. "The most direct route to the Fort Pitt Bridge crosses some heavily infected areas," I explained, pointing to a map we'd marked with known danger zones. "So we'll take this alternate path through the Hill District, then approach the bridge from the north. It's longer, but potentially safer." "What if the bridge is blocked?" Deshawn asked. "Military checkpoint or just abandoned vehicles?" It was a valid concern. "We have contingencies. There's the West End Bridge as backup, or, in worst case, we try to find boats at the marina." The reality was that any plan had significant risks. We were fleeing into uncertainty, abandoning the security we'd built for the promise of survival elsewhere. But there was no alternative. As we made final preparations, I took a moment alone in the forge area. The coals still glowed faintly, the tools we couldn't take hanging in their familiar places. This space had been more than just a workshop. It had been a symbol of human ingenuity and resilience. The ability to create, rather than just consume, had defined our community. I picked up a small piece of steel bar and heated it quickly in the dying coals. With practiced movements, I hammered it into a simple shape. A key. Not functional, just symbolic. When it cooled, I placed it in my pocket. Whatever we built next, it would carry the spirit of this place. Zach completed his diversion system with 30 minutes to spare. "It'll create a series of loud impacts about 2 minutes after we trigger it," he explained. "Should draw most of them toward the front of the building while we slip out the back." "Good work," I told him, genuinely impressed by his innovation. "When all this is over, you'll have a bright future as an engineer." He grinned despite the tension. "If we survive?" "When," I corrected. "When we survive." Final checks complete, vehicles loaded, I gathered everyone for one last moment together in this place that had sheltered us. "What we built here wasn't just about physical survival," I told them. "It was about preserving knowledge, skills, community. We're taking the most valuable parts with us, not just in our packs, but in our minds and hearts. Whatever we find across the river, we'll rebuild." Jamal stepped forward holding something in his hand, a new medallion, hastily but skillfully made. He handed it to me. "For the forge," he said simply. I examined it in the dim light. Unlike the memorial medallions for people we'd lost, this one bore a simple forge hammer design with the words "Steel Remembers" etched below. The gesture nearly broke my composure. I nodded, unable to speak for a moment, then carefully placed the medallion in my breast pocket, close to my heart. "Time to move," Coach announced from his position by the back door. "Zach's diversion is set." We moved with practiced efficiency. Zach triggered his device, then ran to the pickup truck. We waited the calculated 2 minutes, hearing the mechanical impacts begin at the front of the building. The infected responded as predicted, shambling toward the noise and away from our exit route. I opened the back door cautiously, checking for stragglers. The alley was clear enough, just 2 infected at the far end, already turning toward the noise from the front. "Go," I whispered. The van pulled out first, moving slowly until clear of the immediate area. The pickup followed closely. I was the last to leave, pulling the door shut behind me and climbing into the passenger seat of the pickup. As we pulled away, I allowed myself one backward glance at Russo's auto shop, at the forge that had become our haven. In the distance, dawn was still hours away, but somewhere beyond the darkness waited whatever containment measures the military had planned. Our race against that deadline had begun. The first part of our journey proceeded better than I had dared hope. The streets were relatively clear, most infected drawn to other disturbances or simply wandering aimlessly in the pre-dawn darkness. We maintained radio contact between vehicles, keeping our headlights dimmed to avoid unwanted attention. Then, as we entered the Hill District, our luck changed. A massive group of infected, easily 100 or more, filled the street ahead, blocking our planned route completely. "Hold position," I radioed to the van. "We need to find another way." We consulted our maps frantically, looking for alternatives. Each potential route presented its own dangers. Narrow streets where a single abandoned vehicle could trap us, areas known to be heavily infected, terrain too steep for our loaded vehicles. "There," Deshaun pointed to a service road that ran alongside the railroad tracks. "It's not on the main map, but it connects to Station Square. From there, we could reach the Fort Pitt Bridge." It wasn't ideal. The service road would be narrow, potentially difficult to navigate, but it offered a path forward when we desperately needed one. "Let's do it," I decided. "Lead the way." We backtracked carefully, then turned onto the unmarked access road Deshaun had identified. The surface was rough, slowing our progress, but it was clear of both infected and abandoned vehicles. A small miracle in itself. The radio crackled. Dr. Chen's voice came through, tense but controlled. "Miguel's condition is deteriorating. The movement is harder on him than I anticipated. We need to reach stable shelter soon." I checked my watch. Less than 5 hours remained before the containment deadline. "We're going as fast as we can," I assured him, though the words felt hollow against the urgency of our situation. The service road narrowed further as it approached the railroad yard. The van ahead slowed to navigate between stacked cargo containers. In the pre-dawn darkness, visibility was poor despite our headlights. "Something's moving up ahead," Coach reported from the van. "Can't tell if it's infected or not." I strained to see through the windshield. Shadows moved between the containers, too coordinated to be infected but clearly trying to remain concealed. "Stop," I ordered over the radio. "We're not alone." Both vehicles stopped, engines still running for a quick escape if needed. I signaled for silence as we watched the shadows moving between containers. These weren't infected. They moved with purpose, with coordination. Human survivors, but whether friend or foe remained to be determined. "We know you're there," a voice called out from the darkness. "Turn off your engines. We have weapons trained on both vehicles." I exchanged glances with Jamal and Deshawn. Surrendering our mobility could be fatal, but so could provoking a firefight when we had injured people and limited ammunition. "We're evacuating the city," I called back. "Military's planning containment measures at dawn. We're just passing through to cross the river." A long pause followed. Then 3 figures emerged from between containers, weapons lowered but ready. The leader, a woman in her 40s with close-cropped gray hair, approached cautiously. "What kind of containment measures?" she demanded. "The kind that kills everything in the contamination zone," I replied bluntly. We intercepted a military broadcast. Sectors 7 through 12 will be hit at 600 hours. That's less than 5 hours from now. She studied my face, searching for deception. Finding none, she turned to her companions. "Wake everyone. Pack only essentials." Then back to me. "We've been living in the old station offices. 37 people, including children and elderly. We have vehicles, but not enough for everyone." I understood immediately what she was asking. With a silent prayer that I wasn't making a fatal mistake, I made a decision. "We can take some of your people, but we need to move fast." The woman nodded sharply. "I'm Elaine, former Army Corps of Engineers. Give us 15 minutes to gather our people and supplies." While Elaine's group prepared, I conferred with our team. Fitting additional survivors into our already crowded vehicles would be challenging, but leaving people behind to die wasn't an option any of us could accept. We reorganized our loads, creating space for passengers at the expense of some less critical supplies. True to her word, Elaine returned in 15 minutes with her group. They were disciplined and prepared, carrying only small packs of personal items. Among them were 7 children and 4 elderly adults, all of whom we prioritized for the van. The remaining spaces were allocated based on medical need or specific skills. Elaine approached me as the loading continued. "We have 3 vehicles of our own, 2 working, 1 that needs a jump start. If your mechanic could help, we can move more people." I nodded to Zach, who immediately went to assist. While they worked, Elaine showed me a detailed map of the western areas outside the city. "We've been scouting across the river. This hospital complex your doctor mentioned is compromised, heavily infected, but there's an alternative." She pointed to a location about 5 miles beyond the city limits. National Guard Armory, concrete construction, fenced perimeter, backup generators. Our scouts reported it was abandoned but secure. The armory offered significant advantages over the hospital: better defensive position, likely supplies, possibly weapons. "How certain are you that it's clear?" "Scouts were inside 4 days ago. Found signs of a last stand, but the defenders apparently evacuated after holding out for some time. No infected inside the perimeter when they left. It was a calculated risk, but potentially a better option than our original plan." I brought Coach, Doctor, Chen, and Sophia into the discussion. After weighing the alternatives, we agreed to make the armory our new destination. With Zach's help, Elaine's group got their 3rd vehicle running. Our expanded caravan now consisted of 5 vehicles carrying over 50 survivors. The logistical challenges had multiplied, but so had our combined skills and resources. We established a driving order with the most vulnerable passengers in the middle vehicles, the strongest fighters in the lead and rear. Radio communication was established between all five, with strict protocols for emergencies. Dawn was approaching as we finally continued our journey toward the Fort Pitt Bridge. The sky had begun to lighten almost imperceptibly in the east, a deadly countdown to whatever the military had planned. Elaine rode in our pickup, providing local knowledge that proved invaluable. "Bridge approach will be the most dangerous point," she warned. It was a major evacuation route initially, likely choked with abandoned vehicles and possibly infected. Her assessment proved accurate. As we approached the bridge, we encountered a chaotic tangle of vehicles blocking most lanes. The narrow path that remained would require precise navigation. "I'll guide the van through," I decided, jumping out to walk ahead of our lead vehicle. Coach took over coordination from the pickup. Navigating the maze of abandoned cars required constant communication and occasional physical clearing of obstacles. Twice, we had to push stalled vehicles aside to create passage. The work was painstaking, exhausting, and terrifyingly slow as the eastern sky continued to brighten. We were halfway across the bridge when disaster struck. Miguel's condition suddenly worsened dramatically. The van stopped as Dr. Chen worked desperately to stabilize him. Through the rear window, I could see Sophia's panicked face as she assisted the doctor. "He's crashing," Chen's voice came through the radio. "I need to establish an IV immediately. Can't do it while moving." Every minute we remained stationary increased our danger, both from the approaching deadline and from infected who might discover our position. But Miguel's life hung in the balance. "How long?" I asked Chen. 10 minutes minimum. Might not be enough. I made a rapid assessment. Everyone except the medical team and essential drivers continues forward on foot. Clear the path ahead. The vehicles will follow when Miguel is stabilized. It wasn't an easy call. Separating our group created new vulnerabilities. But waiting in place could doom us all, and moving the van immediately might cost Miguel's life. Jamal, Deshawn, Elaine, and about 20 able-bodied survivors continued forward on foot while the vehicles remained clustered protectively around the van. Those of us who stayed formed a defensive perimeter, watching anxiously for any sign of infected or other threats. Dr. Chen worked with methodical urgency, his hands steady despite the circumstances. Sophia assisted, her face tight with fear, but her movements precise. I watched Miguel's pale face through the window, this young boy who had become a symbol of our commitment to preserve life at all costs. 10 minutes stretched to 15. The sky continued to lighten. Through breaks in the city skyline behind us, I could see the eastern horizon turning from black to deep blue. Whatever containment measures were planned, they would begin soon. Finally, Chen gave the signal. He stabilized. "We can move." We resumed our careful navigation through the vehicle graveyard that the bridge had become. Ahead, our advance group had made significant progress clearing a path. We reached the western end of the bridge with just over an hour before the military's deadline. The city behind us looked peaceful in the pre-dawn light, almost beautiful. It was hard to imagine it was condemned, that in an hour some unspecified devastation would be visited upon it. I thought of our forge, of Tony's shop, of the school where this journey began, places that had defined my life, soon to be erased. Beyond the bridge, we reunited with our advance group and continued toward the armory. The terrain became increasingly rural, abandoned vehicles less frequent. But our pace remained agonizingly slow, limited by caution and our heavily loaded vehicles. 45 minutes before the deadline, we crested a hill that gave us a view back toward Pittsburgh. The city was still clearly visible, its distinctive skyline silhouetted against the brightening sky. "We should be outside the containment zone now," Elaine said. "But I'd feel better with more distance." I agreed. Whatever the military planned might have effects beyond the strictly defined sectors. We continued pushing westward, the armory still miles ahead. At precisely 600 hours, we all stopped, turning to look back toward the city. For several long moments, nothing happened. The skyline remained unchanged, peaceful in the early morning light. Maybe they delayed it, Zach suggested hopefully, or canceled it altogether. Then we saw it, not the explosion some had feared, but something almost more terrifying in its clinical precision. Aircraft appeared, flying in formation over the city. They released what looked like a fine mist that descended slowly over the urban area. Where the mist touched, it seemed to cling, spreading like a living thing. "Chemical agent," Elaine said grimly, "designed to neutralize the infection by killing all biological material." We watched in horrified silence as our city disappeared beneath the spreading cloud. Everything we'd known, everyone we hadn't been able to save, all being systematically erased. The weight of what we were witnessing pressed down on us all. "We need to keep moving," I finally said, tearing my eyes away from the disturbing spectacle. "We're not safe until we reach the armory." The remainder of our journey passed without major incident. The armory appeared on the horizon just as the sun fully cleared the eastern mountains, a sprawling concrete complex surrounded by chain-link fencing. As Elaine had reported, it showed signs of having been defended but ultimately abandoned. The main gates were secured with heavy chains, which we cut using tools salvaged from the forge. Inside, we found a facility largely intact: barracks, offices, storage areas, and a central parade ground. More importantly, we found functioning backup generators, clean water from deep wells, and substantial stockpiles of non-perishable food. The first hours were devoted to securing the perimeter, establishing a medical area for Miguel and other patients, and organizing sleeping arrangements. People worked with the efficiency that comes from shared purpose and shared trauma. Despite being a hastily combined group from different backgrounds, we functioned as a unit. That evening, as relative calm settled over our new sanctuary, I found a quiet corner of the armory's roof to watch the sunset. The distant city was hidden behind hills now, but the memory of that descending mist remained vivid. Jamal found me there, carrying something wrapped in cloth. "I finished this during the drive," he said, handing me the bundle. "Thought it was important to complete it today." I unwrapped it to find a new medallion, larger than the others. It bore a stylized image of Russo's auto shop with the forge prominently featured. Around the edge, he had carefully etched, "The Forge, Pittsburgh, Day 7. "It's beautiful," I told him, genuinely moved by the craftsmanship and the sentiment behind it. "I want to start a new series," he explained, "for the armory, for whatever we build here." His young face was serious but hopeful. "The Forge was just the beginning, right?" I nodded, thinking of everything we'd experienced in that single week: the losses, the struggles, the moments of unexpected humanity. Just the beginning. In the days that followed, our combined group established what would become known as Forge Armory, a community built around the principles of knowledge sharing, skill development, and cooperation that had begun in that auto shop in Pittsburgh. The Forge itself was rebuilt, larger and more efficient than before, becoming once again the heart of our community. Miguel recovered fully and eventually became doctor. Chen's apprentice, learning to synthesize insulin and other critical medications from available materials. Sophia developed a medical training program that preserved and passed on healthcare knowledge. Coach organized security and established a network of scouts that kept us informed about surrounding areas. And I continued teaching, not just metalworking now, but the philosophy behind it. The importance of creating rather than just consuming, of passing knowledge to the next generation, of building something that would outlast us all. The medallions became our tradition, markers of our history, reminders of those we'd lost, celebrations of what we'd achieved. They hung in our new forge, gleaming in the firelight, telling the story of a community forged in crisis but tempered with purpose. Steel remembers every hammer blow, every heating and cooling, every stress and strain that shapes it. Like the metal we worked, our community had been transformed by fire, becoming stronger and more resilient than before. Whatever challenges the future held, we would face them together, shaped by our past, but not defined by it. The apocalypse had taken much from us, but it had given us something too. The opportunity to rebuild not just survival, but civilization itself, founded on the values we chose rather than those we inherited. As I watched Jamal teaching a group of children the basics of metalworking, I realized that in saving these skills, these children, this knowledge, we hadn't just survived the zombie apocalypse. We had begun to overcome it.